Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today's topic is adoption, particularly as it relates to genealogy. Now, if I had to pick one topic that I get asked the most questions about in aggregate, it would be adoption. Whether that adoption is you looking for a birth parent or whether that adoption occurred a couple of centuries ago in your ancestry. I get asked those questions every day through email and in person as I go out and talk to our members and subscribers. So really, you may think that adoption is just this unique little niche of genealogy that only affects some people, but the reality is that most of us are going to be affected by it at some point in our family tree. It's not really all that uncommon. As a matter of fact, when the Industrial Revolution began, it's estimated that 7 out of every 100 births were illegitimate, and oftentimes those children were given up for adoption or placed with a family member. So, the challenges of adoption in genealogy research, we've broken them down today into 3 categories based on time period. We only have 20 or 25 minutes, and so this is going to be a really high-level overview, but I'm going to provide you with the information you need to dig into it more specifically based on your specific research challenge or the adoption that you're looking into at the moment. Now, keep in mind, one of the things you need to think about is why the adoption may have occurred. There were women who died in childbirth, fathers who went off to war and never came home. All of those would create an orphan. Now, today we might think of an orphan as somebody who had lost both parents, but for a long period of history, you could be considered orphaned if you lost either parent. And sometimes a father wasn't able to raise his young children if he didn't remarry quickly, and so he would farm his children out to other family members. Sometimes that became a formal adoption. More often than not, it was an informal situation where the child just went to work for or be raised by another family, and oftentimes would take on the name of that family. If the father went off to war and never came home, or whatever circumstance caused his death, again, a mother might not be able to support those children. So it doesn't necessarily mean that both parents are deceased if a child is considered orphaned. That's one of the things to keep in mind. Another circumstance that produces adoption situations is illegitimacy. Now, since about 1917, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute, but since about 1917, the circumstances surrounding illegitimacy have been very, very shameful for a large portion of the beginning of the 1900s. Things were shrouded in secrecy. Most often it was closed adoption laws that started to be put into place to keep that under wraps. Women were sent away to have babies and then came back as if nothing had happened. Prior to that, illegitimacy was viewed a little bit differently. Oftentimes the mother would be hauled before a court and it was demanded that she identify the father. And so there's records that were left because of that. So for whatever reason this adoption occurs in your family, whether it's formal or informal, there could still be paper trails. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is just the records that are left behind because of those paper trails and where you're going to find some of those records. Okay, let's dive in. So the 3 major time periods that we're going to focus on today as it relates to adoption and genealogy research are going to be pre-1850, and the reason for that is starting around the mid-1800s, there started to be a lot of agencies and organizations and laws formed around adoption. So before that, adoption was a lot more of an informal process, but still not impossible to trace. Then we're going to kind of look at a century period of time there from about 1850 to 1950. And then you'll notice our third time period actually overlaps that middle time period. And here's why. In 1917, there was a law passed in a state that started what we now know as the modern adoption era, or modern adoption laws. So then it took about 30 years, till about 1950, for those kinds of laws to roll through all of the United States, which basically provided for closed adoptions and altered birth certificates. And again, that was mostly because of the shame and the secrecy surrounding illegitimacy or children born out of wedlock. And it was mostly about protecting the mother, the birth mother, more than it was about keeping the information from the child. And in most states, those laws still are on the books. So let's actually start with that post-1917 era and just give you some information that you need, whether it's you that was adopted or a parent or a grandparent. The first thing you need to figure out is where that adoption occurred. Not where the child was born, but where the adoptive parents were likely living when the child was adopted. It's most likely that that was going to be handled in a family court where that adoption occurred. The next thing you need to just be aware of is whether or not the adoptee, if it's yourself, is over 18 years of age. Oftentimes, if you're not, the courts and nobody's going to pay attention to you or give you the information that you need from a legal standpoint. There are still some other avenues for you to explore. If you're over 18 and you have figured out where that adoption occurred, you can petition the court in that county where that adoption occurred. Now, if the adoption occurred, if you're looking for something for a parent or a grandparent, just double check. Remember that overlap between 1917 and 1950. Just double check the laws of the state to see when their closed adoption laws went into place, if they have them. It could be that happened after the person was born, and so you might not need to go through this court petition. You could just order an original copy of a birth certificate. But if it's a closed adoption state and those laws came into play after or before the person was born, you're going to need to probably petition the court in the county where the adoption occurred. The other thing that you're going to want to do is register with state and national reunion registries. Now, this may seem fairly new to some of you, and so let me just kind of give you a couple of brief anecdotes to explain to you why this is important. Even if you're looking for someone who is long deceased, I would still recommend registering with these reunion registries. I have a friend who recently found out that her mother had given up some children, a couple of children, for adoption prior to marrying and having a family with her husband. Now, this friend of mine is the only one of her siblings that knows about this, and she doesn't even know if her father knows about it. And her mother's dying, and her mother made it very clear that she did not want to have anything to do with a search for these birth children, but that if this friend of mine wanted to look for them after she passed away, that she was welcome to do that. And so this friend of mine has already got all the information about the state reunion registry in the state where the children were born and adopted, and the national reunion registries, so that when her mother passes on, she can register with those organizations. That she is looking for these siblings. So it's not always birth parents that are looking to reunite with birth children and vice versa. Sometimes it's siblings that are seeking others. And so registering with those registries get your information out there. Even if you don't know the name of your birth parents, you can still register with the location where you were born, the date that you were born, any identifiable information that they can provide, whether you know the name of the birth parents or not, can help you make those connections. If you know the name of the hospital where you were born, if you have any identifiable birthmarks, any of that kind of information is going to provide more opportunity for connection with some of these registries. And then the final thing that I would recommend is if you know the hospital where you or your parent or grandparent was born, check with hospital records. Now, if it's a really old hospital and we're looking for old records, the hospital may not still have them. They might have been turned over to a local historical society or an archive. They might be in a state archive or held by some other government organization, depending on what type of a hospital it is. Or they may be with the hospital. Those hospital records are going to be different than the official birth certificate or the court records. They're going to have kept a record of the patients that were in the hospital, in this case the mother, the birth mother, the children that were born, the dates and times that those births occurred. That's the kind of information that you're going to find in hospital records that might be separate from the vital records or the adoption records that you might be looking for. Just another avenue for you to explore. Okay, let's now look at that middle period of time, starting in about the mid-1800s and going through to about the mid-1900s before closed adoption laws had rolled through most of the United States. You're still going to need to know where that adoption occurred. That becomes important, again, because the laws changed over time. Also because over time, starting in about the mid-1800s, there were a lot of charitable institutions and organizations that were formed to deal not just with adoptions, but orphans, abandoned children, abused children, lots of different kinds of organizations. Some of them were government-run or government-funded orphanages and institutions. Some of them were managed and run by churches or religious organizations. Some of them were run by local community organizations. So if you know where the adoption occurred, you can start looking into what kinds of charitable institutions and organizations may have been in that area, and then where those records have ended up. And let me tell you about these records. I have looked through some of these. These records oftentimes will list the date that the child arrived. If it was a family member that dropped them off, remember, just because a child has a parent, if they had lost another parent, they might still be considered orphaned. And so if it was one of their parents that dropped them off, sometimes it will include information about siblings. If a group of siblings was taken care of by one of these organizations, it'll list all of the information about the siblings. And when you're really lucky, and I have seen this, when you're really lucky, when those children then are either adopted out or fostered out to a family, then information about when they left that institution and into whose care they went will also be recorded. Now here's the thing, a lot of times in the mid-1800s in particular, those children that were sent to live with other families might not have been formally adopted. But as they grew up, depending on how old they were when that foster situation occurred, they may have taken on the surname of the family that they went to live with. So that the records from those institutions can provide that bridge for you. I can't talk about 1800s adoption and orphanage situations without just mentioning the orphan trains. If you're not familiar with them, it's a very fascinating piece of history. From about 1853 to about 1929, orphanages, particularly in New York City, were overrun. And so the solution was what were called orphan trains, where they sent groups of orphans to cities and towns in the Midwest to be fostered or adopted by families in the Midwest who needed extra farm help or who wanted those children. It relieved a problem in New York and helped solve problems in the Midwest. And so there are really great records of the orphan trains. And there's actually an organization that is collecting those kinds of records, and you can find that if you just Google orphan trains. There's some great websites about that. There are other similar things that happened in other countries. There are the young immigrants to Canada, the British home children, the ragged schools. All of those are from Britain and Canada, similar situations where large groups of orphans were almost forcibly migrated to other places to help relieve the burden on the communities where they were living. When you're doing research into families that may have taken in adoptees or into the biological parentage of those adoptees, look for, now census records may seem like a very simple thing, but oftentimes when children were first put in a home, they may have maintained their original last name. So when you're looking at census records, look for children with different names. A lot of times, it was family members that actually adopted those children. And so, for example, if a child got pregnant, if the mother of that family was still of childbearing age, even if she was a little bit older, she may have secreted the daughter away or kept her hidden and then produced that baby as her own. And so really what may look like this caboose child born years after the last child in a family may actually be the oldest grandchild born to one of those daughters in the family. So look at the census records, look at the way that families are structured, see if you can't look for some clues in some of that. Guardianship records were very important in a time when property rights were attached. If a child was going to inherit from their parent, they needed a guardian assigned to help manage that before they came of age. And so don't just look for guardianship records, but also look for probate records. Probate records most particularly are wills, and look for clues in theirs. Look for little words like my natural child. Look for large inheritances given to children who have no apparent connection to the person leaving the will. Is it possible that they're leaving property to a birth child or an illegitimate child that they have not previously claimed? Pay attention to those kinds of things. If you have a clue from other records about who a parent might be, go look for some of those types of records. And then always just keep in mind that through this period of time and before, adoption very frequently was informal. That doesn't make it impossible to trace. It just makes it a little bit more challenging. It just means you really need to dig into some of these records and look for clues that might lead you to who those birth parents are. Is it a grandparent that's taken in a grandchild? Is it a child that's been taken in by an aunt or an uncle on one side or the other of their family? Who was living in the community that may have taken that child in? Who were the leaders in the church that it may have looked good for them socially to take those children in and give them a home and a name? So those are the kinds of clues that you're going to be looking for to help prove or disprove who the biological parents are. Now, pre-1850, again, you may feel like this is so difficult to do, but there are clues to be had. It sometimes requires that mining of those records, and you just need to keep in mind that adoption may have been informal, but there are records available that will give you clues. Read those probate records very carefully. If you have a child that was adopted, they may have known who their own birth parents were. They may know who their siblings are. So I would start with the probate records of the adoptee, of the person in question. Did they leave property to a sibling if they didn't have children? Did they leave property to nieces or nephews that they may have known about, even though they might have been adopted by another family? Then, again, try to see if you can figure out who else in the community might have been the birth family for this person. Sometimes a child may have been apprenticed out to a biological father or grandparent. Look for those guardianship records. If a father died and a mother couldn't afford or was not in a legal position to take possession of the inheritance, who was assigned as the guardian? Who is it that they are guardian for? And look to see what information is listed about the deceased and what information is included about them. Again, a lot of times you're looking for collateral family members or community members. And then once you have an idea of who the possibilities are for parentage, then go back and read their probate records. Again, looking for clues about information about who they're leaving that property to. Now, one of the things pre-1850 that I mentioned earlier is that illegitimacy had a different stigma through different periods of time. Prior to the mid-1800s, it was actually kind of shameful, but forced out into the open, as opposed to as we got into the beginning of the 1900s when it was shameful and kept secret. And so a lot of information can be found just knowing about what time period you're looking for. Those poor law records mean that a family was not able to support their children. And whether it's a single parent or even two parents, if they couldn't support their children, then the community was supporting them. And that's handled differently in England than it is here in the United States. But then if those children had to be put into a poorhouse, again, you're going to have records for that. If those children were illegitimate, then you're going to have records of that as well. There's a whole series of records called bastardy documents, and you can Google that. If you just Google genealogy and bastardy, you're going to find that oftentimes there are court records that relate to the woman being called into court to declare who the father was. Sometimes she would admit it, sometimes she wouldn't. If she did admit it, then there were additional court records created when the father was called in to testify. Sometimes he would admit it and sometimes he wouldn't. All of this created paperwork that are considered bastardy documents or illegitimacy records. And the reason is because the community didn't want to have to support the children of these relationships. They wanted the fathers to support them. And so they would do everything in their power to see if they could figure out who that father was and to make him financially responsible for that child. So prior to 1850, particularly, I know there happens to be really rich collections of records in North Carolina, for example, where you have those court records that just lay it all out on the line about who the father was and what happened to that child. So look for those kinds of records. Just a couple of things in closing as we wrap up here. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, well, who do I list as the parents in the family tree? Do I list the adoptive parents or do I list the biological parents? And the answer to that question is yes. You list both of them. There is, both on Ancestry trees and in Family Tree Maker, a relationship status. So once you've assigned parents to a child, you can go into that relationship status. The default is biological, but you can change it to adoptive or fostered, okay, step, right? And so you have that option to include both the biological parents and the adoptive parents. And I would encourage you to do that. I've mentioned a few things you can Google. I would recommend that you Google adoption and genealogy. Maybe put in a birth year and a state in that Google search. That will give you really specific links to things that you might need to help look up what you're looking up specifically. But hopefully this has provided you with an overview of what types of records you should be looking for and the challenges that you're going to encounter as you do this research. I'm just going to recommend finally 2 articles. Both are on genealogy.com. If you're not familiar with genealogy.com, it is another website owned by Ancestry.com. And there are 2 articles that have been written on there that are just excellent to give you more information, a little bit more detailed than we had time for here. And both articles include a lot of links to other places where you can go to get the information that you're looking for. So I know you can see these on your screen, but I'm just going to read them to make sure that everybody has this information. The first one is genealogy.com/52_Donna, DONNA.html. And then the second article is going to be found at genealogy.com/69_ Taylor, TAYLOR.html. Again, both of those articles, great information that dive a little bit deeper into this subject and also provide you with a lot of links to information that will help you in your search. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you have more questions about this topic and are watching this live, I will be on chat in just a few minutes to answer whatever questions you have. If you're watching an archived version of this, please email me at ask@ancestry.com. I do read those emails, and then if I see that I'm getting a lot of a similar type of question, we'll schedule a follow-up presentation. If you have other questions you'd like to see addressed in a future broadcast, please use that same email, ask@ancestry.com. You can then check our Facebook page, click on our events tab there to see the topics and dates and times for our future live stream presentations, and RSVP there for a reminder so that you don't miss us when we're on. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.